Hi everyone, and welcome back to our Walk in My Shoes series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, my name is Zofia Sahanik and I am the Director of Membership and Development here at Philanthropy Impact. I'm also the moderator of this members web series. As a non-profit organisation, we have the mission to increase the flow of capital for good by enabling private clients and their families to match their purpose-driven wealth strategies with their values, capturing their sustainable impact, investment and philanthropy preferences across the spectrum of capital. You will learn all about that in these sessions if you watch regularly. We do this by working with the professional advisory space to offer networking and educational opportunities. This series is very much part of the membership journey with Philanthropy Impact, and a great way to stay connected to the issues facing wealth holders looking to create impact and also showcase new innovations and trends. Quick house rules. This is a very quick espresso shot of a webinar at just 30 minutes, so we don't open the floor to Q&A, but we do encourage your views and questions via the chat for our panel. Please feel free to introduce yourselves that way as well. This is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I will now introduce our panel for today. We have our CEO, John Pepin, who will be facilitating the conversation. And joining John, we welcome Keith MacDonald, who's the Senior Advisor of Wealth Management at EY. And Cath Dovey is the co-founder of Beacon Collaborative. Stephen Hart is Associate Director of Buzzacott, and Richard Cassell, who's of counsel with us. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you now, John, to make a start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. This is all about how we can manage in this unprecedented time and what is the impact on the professional advisory marketplace, but also on their clients, on their philanthropic giving, on their impact investing, etc. I would like to start off by just asking a general question of all the panelists. And if you could talk a bit from your perspective, because you all come at this slightly differently, how you've seen things change in the last few years, what you see happening over the next couple of years. We did a magazine just after COVID started, and it was all about what kind of society we want to build. It was a gigantic number of articles, over 30 articles, and it was the most positive thing. It was really great editing because I enjoyed it and people were really positive about bringing change. So what do you see has happened and will happen over the next little while? Let's start with Richard.
Thank you, John. Well, I think we do indeed live in a time of change. I wear two hats, as it were, in that I'm a lawyer who advises charities. I'm also, and donors, I'm also a trustee of several charities and a very active school governor and chairman of another school. So the change in the last few years, I think, to a great extent, has been placed an increasing emphasis on risk management, so that we can see, for example, at a time of rising stock markets, rising endowments, a pretty positive attitude on the whole to donors. So it became charities and the non-profit sector tended to be in a fairly expansionary mode. Now it is more a question, can we deliver the services with the income we've got? We've seen income being squeezed. We've seen costs rising very, very significantly in many sectors. And that then leads to the question, well, what can we cut? And as a trustee, you're going to be looking at that and saying, how can we keep the core service delivery going and but still manage to trim our budget? And that's a really difficult question. It's much harder than taking a red pencil through a budget. You've got to look at the things that are what's going to impact your medium-term future, what's going to actually affect the service delivery, what's going to really increase your risk. Obviously, I would say simply completely slashing the legal advice budget is going to increase your risk. Similarly, slashing your training. Do you want to get rid of your training? It's often seen as a fairly soft item. I would suggest that even though you could possibly save a few pounds today, that's probably one of the items that should come later down the list of things you should cut. So it's going to be. We do indeed live in difficult times, and maintaining service delivery with a shrinking balance sheet is challenging. It's a question of choices and making intelligent choices.
Thank you. Stephen, from your perspective, what are you seeing? And are the culture wars starting to impact on these areas? And is this especially seen in the rise of donor advice funds?
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a very ever fast-moving sort of landscape we're in at the moment. I work very much with a lot of grant makers who are still almost recovering from the COVID period and haven't really had much opportunity to take breath. And I suppose, they have had a big draw on their funds in that period of time. And consequently, looking at the landscape ahead, it's very uncertain. I think there's certainly going to be challenges for those organizations who are fundraisers because there will be less personal giving out there. I think there will also be increased demands from lots of applicants for grants and so forth because the overheads that they have are being impacted with what's happening in all countries around the world. So I think those are some of the challenges that are immediate to them. I think a lot of organizations who are particularly fundraisers sort of reacted quite in a knee-jerk fashion when we initially went into COVID and actually cut back on and just following on from what Richard was saying about training in the sense of cut back on fundraising. Well, actually that should have been one of the things they should have hung on to because they don't have those funds therefore now to use in the works that they have. So I think that's pretty difficult for them and maintaining their income. So I think those are some of the areas I certainly found. In terms of culture, I'm not entirely sure what you had in mind there, John, but I suppose that the landscape has changed dramatically in the way we interact, and that has implication on the way people are fundraising and operating for sure. I think that would be my immediate comment.
Thank you. Cath, 2008, when there was the economic crisis, a lot of philanthropists, trusted foundations poured their money into existing donees because they want to protect their initial investment. What are you seeing as happening around the implications of change in the past little while, and what do you see coming out in the future?
I think you're right, the 2008 experience is relevant, but I'll just take us back a couple of years, and we were talking about resilience, we were talking about building back better, we were talking about what kind of society do we want to build. I mean, the cost of living crisis, the inflation curve was entirely predictable in those models. And obviously not to the extent that it's been exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it was entirely predictable. So I think this is the moment where we say, if we do want to build back better, if we do want to realise that vision, then we don't need to be tactical, we need to be strategic, and we need to really look at that budget and say, which are the most important lines on here, which are the things we strategically need in order to build back better and to create that resilience. I am worried that in a vacuum of leadership such as we have at the moment, that we are not seeing a vision for society painted, and we are finding on the other side we've got a lot of donor fatigue. 3 years into COVID and yes, another crisis. This is a really tough time for donors. This is the time that they should be asked some searching questions about their purpose and their mission and what they're trying to achieve and what advice they need in order to deliver that.
What are you seeing with the philanthropists you're dealing with? Because Beacon, in effect, is there to support philanthropic giving. Are you seeing the donor fatigue is lessening the amount of giving? Are you seeing that it's growing? How are you seeing wealthy people responding to this?
I think that the challenge that we've got is that there's been, and Richard refers to this as well, we've had years where donors have been going above and beyond. So they've been supporting their long-standing donor organisations, but they've also been doing their extra bits to support the COVID effort. You know, if they've spent down some of their endowment in some cases, that is not being replenished in the current economic situation, and they have to make very difficult decisions about whether they continue to reach out beyond their core list of grantees. That's really hard. And I think, you know, the choice of supporting your grantee organisations to be more resilient is, you know, a good strategic view to take right now. But the implication of that is we will see a lot of charities once again facing very difficult circumstances and potentially not being able to make it through. And that's why I say we need some leadership. It was much clearer through COVID, you know, where the money would have an impact against the crisis. We don't have clarity at the moment on where the money needs to go to survive this crisis.
Keith, what's your response to all this? Because we've heard from the perspective of funders, we've heard from the perspective of charities. What are you seeing in the financial markets in the with the wealth advisory and other advisory firms?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky because there's different pressures and trends in each of the sort of sets of parties involved. You know, there's the supply side and the people who want to give have got, you know, peaks and troughs in terms of their ability to give. I mean, despite what's been going on, there's still an awful lot of money around, particularly at the top end. But then what they want to support could be very different. And I suppose the positive, if there could be a positive out of something like Ukraine, is that actually it creates a cause that, you know, globally people want to support in terms of, but be it children in Ukraine, whatever. So I think there's a bunch of trends in the supply side. The demand side, though, has got completely different trends. I think, again, Richard was saying, Steve was saying, we have a group of trustees on a call, just come off one, and you know, the financial pressures that because of cost of living and energy and everything, that, you know, day to day an awful lot of charities are under is almost a worse pressure now than when COVID started, because grants were available to cover when COVID started. So, you know, the demand side in terms of the delivery of causes and how causes are supported have got very different trends that don't necessarily match the supply side. And then in the middle of that, you've got a bunch of advisors and infrastructure providers where, you know, on the advisory side, there are pressures like consumer duty and regulation, markets coming down, so difficult discussions with investors, so squeezing in things around philanthropy and giving when there's difficult discussions to be had like that isn't easy. And then you've got an infrastructure to support all of these areas that doesn't really join the dots. You know, the data isn't transparent, the players cross over or overlap or compete. So it's a bit of a mess at the moment. I mean, some of the things, Cath, that you're pushing hard with John's help around who are the players and how does the infrastructure of the whole, how does this all fit together, I think is essential for people to understand from all three of those dimensions how it all fits together. But yeah, at the moment those biorhythms are conflicting. If they can be made to sort of support each other and get a bit of resonance. I'll stop mixing my analogies now.
I don't know what to say. Well, I guess what comes to mind is what you said. You said there's lots of money out there. The level of giving of wealthy people is still rather small. I think a few years ago, Cath, was less than 1% of their wealth for ultra high net worth and high net worth individuals, around that. And the role of professional advisors is really important in this whole thing. But yet the vast majority of professional advisors never mention the word philanthropy with their clients, hardly ever get into discussions about suitability in terms of discussing their values, etc. What do you see is that, do you think that's going to change, or is that just a big issue? It's going to take a long time. Keith.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been talking about the philanthropy forum we've been running for some years now, 6-7 years ago, we had philanthropists talking to private banks and wealth managers saying, we need more support, we need more help, we need more guidance. And that's not really been fulfilled. And that's, you know, so this isn't a new debate. This is certainly not a 2-3 year debate. This is a 6, 8, 10 year debate. So I think there is still a gap in provision of advice and support, because the demand is there, particularly at the sort of family office, ultra high net worth end. And again, now there's other mechanisms. You don't have to create a foundation. You can use a DAF. There's other providers of DAFs, etc. There's different ways that support can be given to do that as well. So no, I think there may have been progress, but there's a long way to go. I mean, Cath, I don't know what you think.
I mean, I agree, but I mean, again, I take a sort of bigger picture view, which is, every problem in philanthropy is a multidisciplinary problem. And so if you don't understand the disciplines that are needed, and if each advisor doesn't understand the disciplines that are needed, it's very, very difficult to support donors on that journey. And, what we're trying to do is create a new sector that has those skills in it, that, is properly networked, is effectively, supported by the data, by the underpinning support infrastructure that's needed. That's long-term work. That's really long-term work. So I think to be where we are 5 years in, where Philanthropy Impact has got a much wider membership, has got the capacity to start mapping some of this out, that is progress that we can measure and that we can point to. Of course, it will be accelerated if more professional advisory firms recognise that there is a role for a professional advisor in this conversation. And I do think, we've perhaps come on to the consumer duty regulation. I do think that there's a chink there, a little opening that we might want to sort of just pry open a little bit and see where that takes us.
I find it really intriguing because we talk about data, but when you look at the whole issue of measuring impact about data management, business intelligence within the charitable sector, it's really quite poor. And that has to also, I think, be enhanced considerably. Harm versus good, Stephen, in terms of the trusts and foundations who have large endowments, it's always been difficult to get them to understand that if they invest in something that could do harm, but they give away the profits to do good, that there's a bit of a contradiction. Are you seeing a change in that, especially as it relates to this discussion, because the role of advisors are really important in that discussion?
Yeah, I think that there is a change. I mean, it very much depends on the DNA of the entity. If you've got a large family foundation and they have a certain approach to their grant making, and some of them, or particularly ones that I'm aware of, have seen a massive increase in organizations looking for core funding to get them through this period and whatever we're coming into. And I think that's almost put a sledgehammer through certain charitable vehicles, I don't know, roadmap, if you want, as a better word. I think they've had to tear up the rule book a little bit and sit back and reflect. So I mean, they're seeing a lot more approaches for core costs. I mean, where does it put grant makers in terms of risk funding? I mean, a lot of successful grants that have been given out have been into risk areas. Now, whether those funders are going to be more risk averse because there's less to go around from investment income being down, or individual donor income being down, I don't know. Time will tell on that. I think the whole risk approach is going to be a really interesting one to watch, and I think we're beginning to see trustees are being very cautious about maintaining their own organizations to be continue in existence. So I think that's something that comes to mind in terms of the sort of the warm areas and the cold areas, so to speak. I think that through the transparency of a lot of grant makers, through 360 Giving is publishing a lot of data. It's still not enough. We could do with more, but I think that's adding a little bit of pressure as well, because I think they can see scrutiny going on, and I think that worries some folk a little bit, because they've had to react in a way in the times we've just been through. So I think that I think are some of the concerns that fly around from my perspective and my hearing.
Well, Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
I also sit on a grant making foundation, and I know that we live in a times when people are becoming more risk averse. and they're very focused on risk management. And that means when you're making a grant, we are going to scrutinize the balance sheet of the grantee organization, because what nobody wants to do is to pour grant money into an organization that's actually going to fail anyway. And so that means that if you're looking for grants, it's very important for the grantee organizations to really manage their assets carefully, so that, because if you leave it to the last minute and think, oh well, maybe I'll get a grant to cover something, that's the point at which you may have become too risky for grant makers to fund. So it's a question of planning, it's a question of risk management, it's a question of can you get rid of some of your overhead costs? Can you maintain, as I think Stephen said, it's bananas to cut the fundraising budget, because you're just undermining your future income. Obviously, you want to keep your fundraising proportionate. Maybe you don't do that glitzy gala ball with very high upfront costs. Maybe you do something a little more low key, but you don't get rid of the fundraisers. Similarly, when you're looking to get your investment advice for if you've got an endowment, yes, you want to trim that, but you want to control that, but you don't want to get rid of it. It's very important, again, that you put in place proper risk management there. I am seeing, on the donor side, I am seeing donors trying to maintain their level of giving. I think there is some significant willingness from donors to respond to the current situation, but they're going to be quite analytical about what they do.
But are you seeing, Keith, did you want to say something? Are you seeing an increase, not in current donors, but in new donors from high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals, or is it pretty well staying the same?
I have to say, I haven't seen a lot of new people coming into this. I've seen some people within families. I've seen a younger generation suddenly become more interested. I've seen, but I haven't seen a whole upsurge in new people looking to fund exciting new projects. That's what I haven't seen that we did see maybe a couple of years ago.
John, could I just come in on that? And we've seen a couple of new funders that have come out, sort of people who have made quite substantial amounts of money through IPOs and what have you. And they've just come into the world of philanthropy with some ideas about how they'd like to be philanthropists, perhaps taking the approach they've used in business to grant making. And I think it's hit them in the face. It's put them off track, so to speak. And I think that's one to keep an eye on, is people initially started down the journey of philanthropy, and this big change has happened and it's taken them right off track, and they're actually finding, I actually know of one who's finding it quite difficult to know how to evaluate how and where they want to give their money as a result, because it's just all changed.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed before, and clearly with from a UK perspective, with Beacon and whatever, the leadership that was looking at things like levelling up and regional partnership of public and private finance, that's been lost a bit in the wash with all the politics and everything that's been going on this year as well. So yeah, it does feel like step forward, step back in a lot of these discussions.
Yeah, can I just quickly, yeah. I mean, I think we've talked about this before in these forums, is the endless confusion between ESG type investing and impact investing. They're quite different. ESG is probably a good thing to do. I've certainly seen on a couple of the foundations that I'm involved with, endowments, they're now viewing ESG as just something, of course, you want to do, and they're bewailing the fact that it is very difficult to get good advice on and good ESG benchmarks. But that's seen as just something that most people should want to do. The impact investing, I have to say, I've seen several organizations trying to do that and finding it much more difficult than they thought.
Keith, are you seeing this from the groups that you're dealing with at EY?
Yeah, I mean, well, and more generally as well. I mean, the data is always the issue, but there's a whole bundle of small and growing organizations, not many charities, some B Corps, which are actually starting to look at how to join the dots in this. So it's either measuring impact, using data surrogates, trying to improve the measurement, and actually coming from some quite unusual angles as well. So no, I think there is improvement, but it's the danger again is the herding cats. It's if they don't all shoot off in different directions, create different data sets, does that make the problem worse or better? So back to the comment about understanding the ecosystem and how it all fits together. I think that's crucial.
So the spectrum of capital is really an important element of this whole thing, and understanding the whole range of ways of investing, whether philanthropy or impact investing, etc. We've only got 5 minutes left, and so far we've spent a lot of time on charities and funders and philanthropists and stuff. But what about professional advisors? I mean, we're at a time where Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. We have major economic and political issues, war, a central bank, largesse has changed, etc., etc. What's the impact, Keith, on professional advisors through all this?
Well, I think I said in my intro, I think that as a set of stakeholders in this, they've got all sorts of conflicting pressures, be it consumer duty, although that we may have time to talk briefly about that could turn into a positive, because this can be linked into suitability and how you ensure you're giving the right advice to people about values as well as risk. But it's difficult when if you've got an advisor who's trying to explain why their portfolio is 15% down, then that's a tough discussion. So it's getting a bit crowded out as a debate in the short to medium term. But then leadership of these areas and these businesses need to correct that and keep the pressure on and the attitude on that these are discussions that need to be had. So I think this year is not a good year from that perspective, but then as I say, that's another challenge to leadership, I think.
But a lot of this is being driven by millennials and Gen Z and women of wealth. So are you seeing any let up from that end, or does it still continue to put pressure on advisors to look at impact investing and support on their donor journey?
Well, I mean, a lot of the advice to the under-advised areas is still word of mouth, family, informal. It's not actually coming from the professional firms. So that's a different type of challenge in terms of how those debates are clean and valid and data supported debates, as opposed to social media and people's opinions. He says expressing an opinion.
Okay, and we've only got a couple minutes left, but Cath, you've been working along with us around FCA and how the FCA can play a role, and certainly consumer duty that's mentioned a couple of times is really key. So our training, for example, trains advisors as part of the new consumer duty around having those discussions with clients. But what are you looking at from for the role of FCA?
I mean, as someone who spent my life trying to put the client at the heart of financial services, this regulation is music to my ears, but it is also, I think someone called it a paradigm shift, a revolution. This is a really big piece of regulation for the financial sector, and they are going to spend a lot of time figuring out how to fit this into their existing operational processes. I would say anybody on this call of influence with organizations may wish to say, as part of putting customer need at the heart of what you do, you should be asking a question about values. If you are regularly in contact with your clients, whether it's through surveys or however, you should be finding out if values are important to them, and you should be reflecting that in your business model. But it's going to take advocates in organizations to make that happen, because senior management will not see it. It will be a blind spot without some pressure from below.
Okay, so I noticed Sophia's here playing my role coming in, but I'm going to extend this a bit because this is a really important discussion. One of the implications of all this, let's say if we take the charity sector, is hardly any of the chief executives have ever lived through inflation. and through tough economic times. I mean, I'm old enough to know that I've done that, and you know, the worst thing you can do is become risk averse and do some of the things that Richard was talking about earlier, about cutting back this and that. And I think a focus on growth is really important. Final words of wisdom to everyone. You can react to that or whatever you want. Then 30 seconds for each, and then Zofia will take over. So who would like to go first?
I'll chip in quickly. I mean, just briefly, I think the values aspect of lots of organizations are going to be crucial. I think the journey to B Corp status for an awful lot of organizations is going to be a mechanism for people to demonstrate those values, and I think bring the conversation you know, around to the ESGs and so forth. And I think for employers also, increasingly, a lot of people are looking to an organization perhaps that has those values clearly outlined and published. So I think that, for me, that's one area I think might improve.
It's interesting because we're starting a new program called Rising Stars, which is for up and coming professional advisors. And we had a meeting of representatives from a lot of advisory firms last week, and it was so positive about what people were trying to do to understand and to deal with this, because of course there's major generational differences between the rising stars and boomers and stuff. Richard, next.
I think I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm still worried about risk in this sector. I think it's about managing risk, being smart about managing risk. You shouldn't be completely risk averse, but you should know what the risks are. And that means that you should get advice. That also means that the advisors, I think, have to be smarter and deliver their advice in a manner that's more efficient and recognizes what's going on in the sector.
You might have noticed a dog in the background. Cath.
I would say, John, to your many years of experience, we all know inflation is the slow killer. It's going to be a slow killer in the charity sector. We have choices now about whether we motivate money to respond to that or not. We know that giving increases when there's a national need. At the moment, it's not clear what the campaign or the appeal is going to be. But when it comes to the fore, you know, we really need an advisory community that can respond, that can make sure that people respond in a way that, as Richard said, manages the risks appropriately, but recognises the role of civil society and, you know, the world that we were all hoping we would come out of COVID and being able to build. It's just going to take longer.
What's really neat is you're coming up in this 30 minutes with a number of really great solutions. So Keith, the final word to you before I go and find out why the dog's barking like crazy.
Shut my dogs out. That's a much better way to do it. Yeah, I agree with the risk issues, the leadership issues. There's an awful lot of negatives around. But I mean, I suppose, you know, there's a British element and a UK element to this and a global element. I think trying to turn as many negatives into positives as we can has happened with COVID, has happened actually with Ukraine. So I think that created a different form of giving and very specific giving. There's already several initiatives around families under financial duress and people helping that. Get as much as we can to turn all the horrible negatives that are around into positives. And our press doesn't help this. Our press is a very negative press, I believe. So trying to keep some confidence and keep some positivity while everything around seems to be crumbling to bits. If we don't do that, then we might as well turn the lights out.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. That was really fabulous.